My stomach has never been so big.
Hey. Here,
Excellent.
we'll fix that.
Cheryl was saying this shirt she likes better than any of my others, but I think it's because you can see the waves in the ocean moving on my stomach. Hi, everybody. I'm glad you're with us. Let me catch up on what's going on. My daughter-in-law and Meryl's daughter, Alexis Swayze Peacock, has been helping me get ready to put this on YouTube, but she's going to take a little break now and have a baby.
Oh.
Her baby is due tomorrow, and it's a little girl, and she's going to be named Julia.
Oh.
And we're in suspense to see if she has red hair or not. Because they're looking forward to a little girl with red hair. Anyway, we have this softer chair here if you'd like it. Glad to have you with us. So anyway, we are still on Facebook Live, but we hope soon to be on YouTube Live. And what we have to do to be on YouTube Live is we need 50 people to go sign up. And we're trying to figure out how they can sign up.
I just signed up, but I'm not sure if it was yours.
Okay, so it's capital N-E-A-L-S. N is the only capital letter, and it's all one word. NEALSHISTORYHUB. And then you're supposed to be able to sign up, and when we get 50, then YouTube will let us do YouTube Live. But until then, we're also going to record this tonight and put it on YouTube to get it going for people. So we're doing what we can. That really is a terrible view. Okay, anyway. So, well, if it's a fashion show, I'm losing. If it's a contest, I lost. Okay, well, so please go on YouTube and subscribe. We had, as of this evening, 21 people who had subscribed. And so we need another 29 and we'll be ready to go there. We think when we get there, maybe the sound will be better, maybe the video will be better, but it's better for cataloging. So you go look up which date you want and those kind of things. So it should be better. Well, how's everybody doing? Good. We have started talking about the Cold War. We first talked about the Cold War in the 1940s. Now we're going to talk about the Cold War in the 1950s. And the plan is we'll go through political events, and then we'll come back and go through the cultural events of the 1950s. And we're very fortunate tonight to have with us people who remember the 1950s. So there may be people here who correct me, and I'm open for that. If you have insights or stories or anything like that, please share those with us. We're really happy to have those. Okay? Okay. We talked last week about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who had been accused of spying for the Soviet Union and turning over secrets that allowed the Soviet Union to get the A-bomb sooner. Again, controversy still exists as to how much sooner it really pushed that up. But my feeling was, if it was 1 minute even, then that was too much. They were selling out the country. They were put on trial, as you know. This man, David Greenglass, Ethel's brother, turned her and her husband in and then testified against him in court. And he received a 10-year sentence, but his wife wasn't arrested. That was the deal he made with the government. They tried to get Julius to go ahead and tell them who his handler was so they could roll up this spy ring in America. And Julius said, I didn't do it. He pled not guilty the whole time. I'm innocent. Right up until they electrocuted him in the electric chair. I did not do this. And Ethel said the same thing. Well, we know now, by being able to get into the records years later, that really Ethel didn't know what was going on. She was a communist, but she didn't understand that they were actually turning over nuclear secrets to the Russians. And David Greenglass, after he got out of prison, many years later, was interviewed and said, yeah, I lied. I said what the government wanted me to say, it was a lie. And they said, well, your sister died. And he said, yeah, but my family lived. Anyway, they went to the electric chair. He died quite easily, one jolt. They had to shock her 3 times to get her to die. And also, her head burst into flames.
Didn't hurt her after she was dead.
But it did cause a lot of cleanup. Anyway, it was a mess. It was horrible. But we know from Russian documents we've been able to get that she wasn't part of the spy ring, that Julius actually was trying to keep her out of it, but they were trying to use her, the FBI was trying to use her against him to get him to fold. And the FBI in one statement said, we knew that Ethel probably wasn't very guilty, but they called our bluff. So?
I think that it was his responsibility too to tell them that she didn't know. I mean, he's gonna die anyways.
Yeah.
Why didn't he? What's wrong with him?
He's a jerk.
I don't know what's wrong with him. You know, you just can't trust spies.
No.
I don't know what was the matter with him.
Liar, cheater, stealer.
What's that?
He was a liar, cheater, stealer.
He was a liar, cheater, stealer. He was.
And wife killer.
Okay. This is about where we left off last time, about where we were to start. This is Joseph McCarthy, United States Senator from Wisconsin. He was, before the war, a judge in Wisconsin, very much a politician. This was not an appointed judgeship. This was a judgeship he ran for. And he knew he stood a better chance of being reelected if he fought in the war. So he went and signed up. And he became kind of in the supply chain more than anything, making sure people had what they needed. But that wasn't going to do it back home after the war. He needed publicity. And so Joseph McCarthy, one of his buddies said, let's take some pictures of you in an airplane. He says, great. So in this picture right here, this is Joseph McCarthy at the machine gun as a tail gunner. And he literally, this is kind of hilarious, he took his machine gun and fired into the jungle around them. And there was a big write-up that went back to Wisconsin papers. Tail gunner Joe shoots more rounds than any other tail gunner in the Pacific. Hi. And so we're gonna have to bring more chairs in next time, of soft chairs. So he got this big write-up about having fired more rounds of ammunition as a tail gunner than anybody else in the Pacific. But it was, it was at the jungle. And so he picked up the name Tail Gunner Joe, and later as he gets in trouble, Tail Gunner Joe is kind of a negative connotation for what he did. He came home from the war. Before he came home from the war, he started running for U.S. Congress, and he was elected to Congress. And in 1950, he is elected to the United States, moves up to the United States Senate. And he becomes a senator from Wisconsin. And he's always worried, the moment he gets in office, he's running for the next one. As he's there, he's the junior senator, meaning many people don't know him, and he craves that publicity, whether that's for his future political career or him personally. And he went to West Virginia to a ladies' flower club. That's not the right word. What would be the word? Garden club, thank you. Yes, he went to a garden club meeting in West Virginia and he gave a speech. And it brought panic and big headlines when he got up and was speaking. And he could see that the congressman, soon to be senator, or maybe by then he was a senator, from California, Richard Nixon, had built his career on hunting down communists. And so Tail Gunner Joe said, that's the way to do it. So he reached in a briefcase and he pulled out a paper and he said, I have here a list of 200 communists that are working in the State Department.
But he didn't have it.
Tail Gunner Joe Nixon did find some spies. I will say that. Tail Gunner Joe never found a communist. He found some people who had been communists, but they had renounced that by the end of the war. But he said these are active communists in the State Department.
In California, they did have quite a few communists.
Well, and Nixon from California had built his career on that, and he and his committee had found some spies. Tail Gunner Joe now pushes that beyond belief. And he says, I'm going to name names. The next week, he was in Salt Lake City, Utah. And he gave a speech in Salt Lake City where he stood up and waved a list and said, yes, I have the names of 98 active communists in the State Department.
What happened to the 200?
Every time he gave a speech, it was a different number. It was never the same number. And immediately, of course, the FBI comes to him and says, we need that list. And we need to know where you got it. Well, Tail Gunner Joe didn't have a list. And he wasn't going to share nothing, and he didn't want to get in trouble, so he just kept giving more and more speeches. Okay. He went from there. He was P.T. Barnum. He was a big showman. But to get people actually hunted down, he needed a pit bull. He needed a pit bull. And I had a picture, I didn't put it on here. He was, in fact, it was, I think, a young man from Massachusetts named Robert Kennedy that suggested, get Roy Cohn. And so he got Roy Cohn on his staff, and Roy Cohn was the pit bull he needed. And Roy Cohn began trying to uproot people's lives. And soon McCarthy was accusing people by name on very flimsy to no evidence. Some of them may have been communists early on, but certainly they weren't at that time, and he began to destroy people's careers. And we began, yes.
What year is this going on?
This is from 1950 to 1954. He is going to rule America. He is going to scare Truman, and he's going to scare Eisenhower. Neither Truman or Eisenhower dared to take him on. It was Hitler's old theory, as if you tell a lie loud enough and long enough, people will believe it.
I have that quote written down.
And he was doing exactly that. And with Roy Cohn, they began to root out, they turned from the State Department eventually to Hollywood, with all the massive communists in Hollywood. Now, there probably were more active communists in Hollywood. They probably weren't threatening the nation.
That was my other question. If you weren't plotting the overthrow of America or something. It wasn't against the law to be a communist, was it?
It was de facto against the law. I mean,
Well, I mean,
your career was over if you were identified as a communist.
Okay. So even if the Constitution allowed you to believe whatever.
Yeah, and you could be in the communist. You could be a member of the Communist Party, especially in Hollywood, where probably the worst thing you'd do for the nation is make some of the dumb movies they made then. But he was ruining people's lives and careers. And then he said, and what's more, we have found homosexuals in the government.
Be better to commit treason.
And they began digging out these homosexuals. Roy Cohn had brought a friend of his on board, and Roy Cohn and this other friend really were hunting these people down. Then Roy Cohn's friend was drafted into the military. Okay, you had to serve. So Roy Cohn and McCarthy went to the military and said, we want this guy who's been on my staff, that's Roy Cohn's friend, we would like him to have a really nice cushy office job and not have to go to Korea because the Korean War is going on. And the army said to him, the only one that dared, don't you tell us what to do. And they treated him like any other person. Well, that made Cohn and McCarthy mad. And so they accused communists of having infiltrated the army. And he called for hearings on the communists within the army. Now we'll talk, when we get to 1954, we'll talk about what happened right then. But that's when it's slated for. The years are going on. McCarthy is incredibly powerful in our country. People followed him when he had no evidence, no proof of anything. People followed him. And the two presidents during that time were afraid to take him on. The army was the only one, and now they were under the gun. But I will give you a Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Some of you may not know what that means. But there was a great commentator named Paul Harvey who used to tell a story, and then he'd tell the rest of the story. The rest of the story is this. Roy Cohn and his buddy were homosexual lovers. Roy Cohn died of AIDS later on.
And he was chasing them down?
He was hunting them down for Joe McCarthy. Roy Cohn was involved in a lot of other things too. But when you get a pit bull, he's a pit bull everywhere, even with that. And so Roy Cohn becomes, in my mind, kind of a despicable character in history, who maybe somebody could have talked McCarthy into some sense, maybe, but not with the people he put around him, the people he gathered around him. So,
Question?
yes, go ahead.
What was the media's role in all of this?
Oh, he was a media darling. They loved the excitement of watching the commie hunter out there doing his job. And they gathered around him, except one man. Oh, what is his name? Jack Anderson. There was a man who worked for the Washington Post named Jack Anderson. He had originally been from Utah. And he, back there, really began to question McCarthy. And he's the one that's going to lead the charge against McCarthy when McCarthy begins to slip. But the media really quite liked him. And Jack Anderson was an important enough journalist that he could get interviews with McCarthy. But McCarthy was slick. He was pretty smooth. What he wasn't, look at him. He's not a TV guy. He is not a talking head. He doesn't have great hair, in fact, hardly any. He is not a movie star. And if you're going to put this guy on TV, and he tends to sweat a lot under pressure, TV is not going to be kind to him. And that's what you'll see happen when we get to 1954. Okay, we want to talk about a court case that began to change things. Now, we had passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, freeing the slaves, making them citizens, and giving adult males the right to vote. And then when women got the right to vote, black women also got the right to vote. Okay. However, the government had traded political favors. The worst one was Rutherford B. Hayes, who ended Reconstruction in the South as long as he got to be president, as long as eight Southern votes would switch over and vote for him in the Electoral College, and actually on a committee of the Electoral College. And that's how he became president. And from that point on, states ruled their black populations. And Jim Crow laws came into effect. And those Jim Crow laws were, to me at least, unbelievable. Everything was segregated. Because in the court case near the end of the century, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the court ruled that you can have separate facilities as long as they're equal. But nothing that is separate is ever equal. And so blacks could not drink out of white drinking fountains. When they went to a movie, if the theater allowed blacks and whites in the movie, blacks sat in the balcony, whites sat on the main floor. Some of the weirdest ones I've heard, beaches were desegregated. If it was a white beach, black people couldn't swim there. If it was a black beach, white people avoided it. And do you think the black beaches were the nice ones? No. And this one got me. Cemeteries in the South were segregated. Black and white people could not be buried together.
I saw that in Georgia.
Yeah. Segregation was serious and real, and there was definitely separate. There wasn't any equal. And schools, of course, were segregated. Well, a group of people decide they want to challenge this, and they say the way to do it is not through protests or riots or anything like that. The way to do it is through the courts.
They tried.
And so they met in a case in 1950 called Sweat versus Painter. You may not have known much about this one. And this man right here is a black man from Maryland. He was not allowed to go to the University of Maryland because it was segregated. He had better grades than many of the people who made it into law school at the University of Maryland. He wasn't, of course, accepted there. He went to Howard University, an all-black college, got his law degree, and studied constitutional law. And he began to push the court cases. He said, this is the way we're going to change things, through court cases. And it was about this man, Sweat versus Painter. He had applied to the University of Texas Law School. University of Texas Law School. And the University of Texas denied him on the basis that he was black. And he said, okay, separate but equal, Thurgood Marshall could go to Howard. Is there another law school that takes blacks in Texas? And they said, no. He said, well, then that's wrong. If it's still separate but equal, you have got to let me have a law school that takes blacks. And so they sued all the way to the Supreme Court, and Thurgood Marshall fights the case, and he wins. He wins, and they say graduate schools, doctors, lawyers, those kind of things, those schools cannot discriminate on the basis of race. For one thing, they were all receiving funding from the federal government. And so the federal government had a right to regulate them. For example, if you use your GI Bill to go to law school, well then the government should be able to say you have to accept blacks. This was a huge win. This was a huge win, but it wasn't the win. But it's going to start things off.
So that was 50.
1950. Okay, then we passed the 22nd Amendment. Thank you, President Roosevelt. You got this one pushed through. And you didn't even know it because you died. People became concerned that maybe a president like Roosevelt, winning time after time after time after time, was not right. And that there should be, and this was a great concept, term limits. The whole thing of
That
this,
was just for presidents, right?
only for presidents, and still it's that way.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah.
Oh, now we're expressing political feelings.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I tend to agree with you. I like to see turnover in government.
Yeah, new ideas are good.
But look at me. Have I ever turned down a turnover? No, I love turnovers. Even in government. And so the 22nd Amendment was proposed that a president may serve 2 terms. And if a vice president takes office because of the death of a president, he still can have 2 terms.
Plus what he had.
Plus finishing out that president's term, which Lyndon Johnson would do. So,
I have a question.
Yes.
Is that consecutive term limits?
no, that is
2 term limits?
2 terms, lifetime period.
One 4 years ago, another 4,
Maybe a space of 4 years and then another one.
and then another one after that? Because it's not
Nope,
consecutive.
2 term, lifetime.
Okay, clarify.
That's a good question, way good question. So term limits were proposed, and many amendments take quite a long time to pass. This passed in under a year. It was voted on by 2/3 of Congress, given to the states, and 3/4 of the states had to approve it, and they did. Fast.
Was that approved at the legislature level? How's that done?
They had to call a special convention in the states to consider this and then vote.
Okay.
And so the people got to send representatives to that convention. Okay? But it passed 2/3 of both houses of Congress to get there. We made it so you can amend the Constitution. We made it so it's not easy. But on this one, it sailed through. There was general consensus that a president didn't need more than 2 terms. Okay. That was 1951. In 1950, President Truman had said, the scientists came to him again and said, remember that A-bomb? That was fun. And we've built a lot more A-bombs now, especially since we know Russia has the A-bomb. We think we know how to make a bigger explosion. If you take an A-bomb and use it as a fuse to set off hydrogen, you'll make a lot bigger explosion. And Truman said, well, explain to me how this, no, don't explain to me. Just, does it work? And they said, we think so. And Truman said, develop it. And by 1952, we have the H-bomb. And the H-bomb's trigger is an A-bomb, still to this day.
So me and the H-bomb were born the same year. Yay.
2 big explosions.
That's true. That's right. It's my claim to fame. That's right.
Well, this H-bomb, I just want to share with you how big it is. Our first H-bomb that we exploded, would you believe it was 10 times more powerful than the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima? It was not. It was 700 times more powerful than because you went from what we call nuclear fission to nuclear fusion, which is what the sun is doing. We essentially found a way to harness the power of the sun and turn it deadly.
And where does that now
I'll tell you in just a second. Go ahead,
Where were
Jen.
they testing that? Down on the desert, out in Nevada?
Eventually. But since you don't know what it's going to do, and somebody suggested it could cause a chain reaction that would dry up the oceans and things, there was a lot of controversy on this. And so we tested it at, anybody know how to say this? I'm not sure I do. Atoll, Atoll, and the Marshall Islands. We picked an island that we had captured during World War II, and it only had some people on it and animals and things.
Did they get the people?
They did, and I've seen a video clip, which I can't show you because it's copyrighted. If you want to see this, I'll just tell you the movie to go watch. It's on. It's got to be on something. It's called The Atomic Cafe, and it shows them herding these people into a Higgins boat like we used to land at D-Day. And they were bringing their cattle and they were bringing their goods with them, and we herded them on there and we took them off and took them to another island. And then we blew their home up with a bomb, the first one that was 700 times the atomic bomb we dropped on Hiroshima.
And it just
Yeah!
destroyed the whole island.
Is that a picture with that lower picture?
Yes. These are both actually pictures of it.
Yeah, the boomers have to do that.
Now we have bigger bombs than that. That was just our first try. We have bombs that are more than 1,000 times more powerful. In fact, we have bombs, so if we had used an atomic bomb like at Hiroshima, we could have killed everybody in Salt Lake City. Not the whole county, but everybody in Salt Lake City. The atomic bombs, the H bomb that we were developing could kill everybody from Ogden to Spanish Fork. One bomb.
And that doesn't count fallout, probably.
Well, it does count some fallout. And fallout's based on how close to the ground the bomb explodes. Because what fallout is the dirt and dust and ash that gets kicked up and made radioactive. So if you explode it way up high, there's not as much fallout. And the French, who don't work with us very well, invented the neutron bomb, which they would detonate over a city. They could. They tested it. Detonate over a city. It will kill everybody. And within 2 days, soldiers can walk in there without any radiation problem at all.
It doesn't have,
What's that?
it doesn't have any radiation.
It does, but it's a very short-lived radiation. Quick, horrible burst, kills people, and then you can walk in, and if it's canned food, you can open up and eat it.
That almost seems counterintuitive. You'd think the more up in the atmosphere it was, the more they would get carried, on the top.
But remember, it's the dirt, the dust, the ashes that becomes the.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Anyway,
So I got a question.
great, Tom.
What agency was it that did that work? Was it through the Pentagon? Or
Yes, it was through the Pentagon. Eventually, by the 1960s, we'll start the Nuclear Regulatory Agency and the Atomic Energy Commission that will both have
Right. And
say
that
on
was
this.
part of the uranium boom that we saw
It-
here in the West.
It definitely was.
Okay.
But that uranium boom is going at this time down there. Bill Hannard and others from Emory County were down there
Right.
mining uranium like crazy because you still had to have the trigger, which is an atomic bomb.
And so the government was buying up all the uranium they could
And processing it.
processing it.
Yep.
Okay.
And what was it maybe interesting to me as I began to learn about this, it wasn't a government program. It was a guy and his buddy and their mule and some dynamite out there making their own claims and mining their own uranium and then bringing it down for wherever they were getting it, bringing it up to Temple Mountain, where you were loading it up and hauling it down to places like Moab and other places to be processed.
at, wasn't there a uranium mine down there?
There were many uranium mines around there, and that's why they built the processing plant there.
Oh, okay.
And you know what we've been doing since then, and that is, after they processed it and got rid of the tailings, they just piled them up there by the river. And we've spent a lot of money,
Billions.
honestly billions, hauling that up to places and putting it in pods that are sealed where hopefully it won't get out, but it's radioactive.
So Congress funded that,
Congress funded this.
and the president said, okey dokey, go forth and do great things.
Most definitely. But now understand, when it goes off in 1952, Truman's almost done. Truman is almost done in 1952. And so, the man who pushes the atomic weapons race, arms race, is Eisenhower. Because Eisenhower looks at what it costs to keep an army in Europe. And then he looks at what it costs to keep nuclear weapons in Europe. And there's no comparison. An army costs tons more than making a nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons are cheap. So you're going to see as we go on, Eisenhower leans on that nuclear option more than anything. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Oh, by the way, I don't think I mentioned, 9 months later, the USSR detonated their hydrogen bomb. We didn't stay ahead of them very long.
Or did they just somewhere out in their Siberian?
In Siberia. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah, that's the world I grew up in.
we're going to talk about that world. We're going to talk. Anybody here do duck and cover drills?
Yeah, we did.
I did.
You get under your
In
desk.
school, where you had to climb under your desk, and that little piece of desk was going to save you from nuclear war. Yeah, that was good. We're going to talk about why the United States government insisted we do that. Okay. And you know from what we've talked about before that right at the end of World War II, even before the war was totally over, Winston Churchill was voted out. And a Labour Party candidate named Clement Attlee was voted in, and he promised to take care of people from cradle to grave in Britain, make it a welfare state. That was what he said to do. That was in 1945. In 1951, 6 years later, new elections are held. In England, they have to have elections every 6 years unless there's a vote of no confidence before that. And 6 years later, Winston Churchill is reelected as the majority of people in England rejected that welfare state idea and wanted to go back to Winston Churchill's conservative government. And so he is elected for his second, this is really in some ways, you could almost say his third term, but Winston Churchill is re-elected prime minister in 1951 in Britain. Okay, the presidential election of 1952 may be the funniest election we've had for a long, long time by that time. It's just funny. And the main reason I think is both political parties, both Democrats and Republicans, came to Eisenhower and said, will you run for president from our party? They both asked him. Well, he didn't know what he was. He had rarely voted in elections. He was a military man. You're not supposed to take sides in that. The military is supposed to be underneath the political in the United States. So he made a choice, and he chose, Dwight Eisenhower chose to run as a Republican. And they got a man, Adlai Stevenson, a man who had served in government for a long time. The Democrats got to run against him. He didn't stand a chance. Eisenhower was eminently popular. At the time, he had to leave his job, which was he was the supreme commander of NATO. And he left that to run for president. And the other thing he said is, if you'll vote for me, and this made him even more popular, if you'll vote for me, I'll go to Korea. And I will end this Korean War. I will get the Korean War ended. And he chose a very popular congressman, now Senator, Richard Nixon, to run as his vice president. And Eisenhower could give a pretty good speech. Nixon was that showman kind of guy. And then in September, before the election of 1952, Nixon got in trouble. As soon as he'd become senator, he did not get rid of his election fund, which would come to be called the Checkers Fund. But he kept it together and kept accepting donations. And when asked why, he said, just because I got elected senator this time doesn't mean I'm not going to need the money next time. And he used a lot of that money to pay off different things he was doing. None of it could ever be proven that it was for personal use, but campaign use. And he also did a smart thing. He had a woman he had hired to make those decisions and pay the accounts. So there was a layer between him and the money. So he couldn't write a check on his campaign fund. But she could assign that out. But still, the press jumped on this. And they called him a liar and a cheater and a crook.
Tricky dick.
Eventually he'll try to tell everybody, I'm not a crook. But he doesn't know what to do. And Eisenhower says, there's only one thing we can do. We got to drop him off the ticket. We got to dump him. Here it's September. The vote is the first week in November. We got to dump Nixon and find somebody else. And so Nixon, who was campaigning in California, went down to Los Angeles and said, I want to hold a press conference. I just don't want the press there.
There you go.
So he gave a speech before a live audience, live speech. There was no live audience, a live speech. The press were kept in another room and not allowed to ask questions, but they could watch it on TV monitors. And he gave a speech. And here he is. This is him, 1952, September, speaking to America. Now, I just have to ask, you don't have to, does anybody remember this? Okay, we'll get there.
52, I was 2 years old.
You don't remember it?
I was 2,
Oh.
4 months.
Well, he said, if I need to, in his speech, he said, if I need to, I will give back to my donors every penny. But I gotta say, got a little teary-eyed there. Nixon did. There's one donation I'm not giving back. Some kind people donated to my campaign a little dog that's black and white. And so my girls named him Checkers. And they love Checkers, and I'm not giving Checkers back. And out there in TV land, all the people were like, oh no, he's so good. And he called upon the people of the nation to send letters and telegrams and phone calls to the RNC, the Republican National Committee, and tell them we want Nixon running for vice president. And they inundated the RNC, and the RNC was like, we didn't ask for this. It's Eisenhower was going to dump him. Oh, great. And the RNC went to Eisenhower and said, you got to keep Nixon. And he says, don't you think he'll hurt us? And they said, no, I think with Checkers, they're going to. They're going to. Well, today, when you say somebody gave a Checkers speech, it's based on this idea that Nixon gave a sob story to play on your emotions and get what he wants. And so that's what a Checkers speech is today, thanks to Nixon.
When Eisenhower first chose Nixon, did he know him? Was he, somebody said, we need to have California, or?
He was a political choice entirely. He didn't know Nixon. I'm not sure he'd ever met him. He had been in Europe most of the time, or other places, but he hadn't been in America that much. And they needed California. And Nixon had made the transition from Congress to Senate, and that was very popular. And they said, we need Nixon. And then the other thing was, his outgoing personality really kind of complemented Eisenhower's more reserved and dignified personality. And so it was a pretty good choice. And Nixon had made his bones. He had made his reputation hunting down communists. And people were still very afraid. And I'm sure some people suggested, well, get McCarthy. And Eisenhower detested McCarthy. But Nixon, well, okay, that's okay. And you got to realize Nixon was fairly young then. By the way, after Truman, every president up through George H.W. Bush had served in World War II. And Nixon had too. Nixon had been in the Navy in World War II.
Did Eisenhower still have his mistress at that time?
No, he was told when, you know when you're living in Europe and you have a mistress, well, when you come back to America, you need to not have that mistress. But actually, George Marshall, the general above Eisenhower, went to Eisenhower and told him, before World War II was over, you got to dump her. He said, no, I'm leaving my wife for her. And Marshall said, no, you're not. And so he dumped his mistress still in World War II and came back to Mamie, his wife, Mamie Eisenhower.
Okay, he was awful too.
Well,
I couldn't hear.
so Gwen said, so Eisenhower was awful too.
Yeah, I think that's a problem.
Come on, they all had him, right? No, they
Well,
didn't.
morality doesn't seem to be
Most
an
of the
issue
ones who
now.
talked about
elections.
that,
Jimmy Carter didn't have a mistress.
not Jimmy, and not Jimmy.
He was-
George H.W. Bush didn't.
Well,
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
I have always wondered, because a lot of presidents go by their initials, but Eisenhower's name was Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Dwight David
Why
Eisenhower.
did he go by DDE? Where did the I come from?
Does anybody know? I don't know.
You're supposed to know.
I-
You're a teacher.
Okay, a bunch of kids on the playground couldn't say Dwight very well because they had a lisp, and so they called him Dwight. I don't know. There you go. Let's go with that until we learn the real reason.
Well, I think it came from his military career.
Oh, I would imagine.
Somewhere, a nickname.
Yeah. But what a good name to have when you're running for president. What are the buttons saying? I like Ike. There it is right there. It's perfect. And I promised, if you'll vote for me before I become president, between November and when I become president in March, because they hadn't changed that yet, I'll go to Korea and I'm going to start the process to end this war. Okay? Now it's a good place to stop, take a quick break. We've been going for 50 minutes. Let's take just a 4 or 5 minute break and we'll come back.